I learned the fine line between stubbornness and survival the day Elias Harper rode through the gate and took what he'd decided belonged to him. My name is Maggie Wren. At 42, there are more hours behind me than ahead, if you count in ways most people do. Years, winters, the count of calves that came and went under my sudden care. My hands know the heft of a hay fork and the tenderness required to coax a newborn colt into breathing. They know bandaging, suture, the pressure of a palm over a fevered brow when the fever is your only confidant. I'd been widow 3 years when Elias Harper came to make his claim. My Sam's death, painted by the county paper as an unfortunate encounter with law, was as polished and precise as his badge. It said Sam had been shot in self-defense while resisting arrest. He called it an error in judgment, and the paper called it duty. I called it murder. Sam had been a steady man who kept ledgers, mended fences, told jokes to the horses when he thought I wasn't listening. He did not struggle with lawmen. He did not threaten. He'd been in a meeting about cattle routes. Someone's cattle were being steered off by men with Harper's permission, and when he raised his voice, Harper shot him. The Marshal story was neat. Sam a rustler, Marshal a hero. People believed neat things because neat things fit into their days without making them uncomfortable. I did not accept that neatness. The sale notice came with a cold wind. The county seizes property tied to criminal activity. The deputy read to me in the parlor that still smelled faintly of Sam's tobacco and the coal oil lamps he used to fuss with. My hands curled around the arms of the chair until I felt the grooves in the wood. I had enough in the coffers to pay the back taxes for only so long. The bankmen's faces were sympathetic in that way men are when their interest in you is measured in dollars. I had been broken in many small practical ways since Sam's body was brought home, and I buried the one man who'd been my partner in everything. But I was not without skill. I could lay out a ledger in a way that made the men from town stop bending their brows with pity and instead listen. I could stitch a wound that looked like it needed a surgeon's hand because the nearest surgeon preferred reading about horses to living among them. I could break a stubborn calf by the end of 2 long days. I could negotiate a sale of hay in January when snow had convinced others to idle. I could see the bindings of an injustice, and, maybe harder, I could unbind some of them. The first winter was the worst. I still woke in the dark expecting Sam's boots by the bed, the chair to creak where he'd slept for weeks on the couch after a coughing spell. I tended the barn like altar duty. The act steadied me. That evening, just after sunset, when the last of the light was a thin bruise on the horizon, something skittered between the hay bales. I froze, the old reflex that made me notice the smallest sound at night. Then a man stepped out, half shadow, reeking of horse sweat and the road. "You got room?" he asked. His voice was low, not a plea so much as a polite question tossed over a fence. He could have been anyone. He could have been trouble. The county had deputies who liked to patrol at night to show they were busy, but his hand, when it brushed the beam to steady himself, was careful. A man who hides that well has reason to survive. "Who sent you?" I asked. Practical. The question was never trust at first glance. It was link and ledger. I kept a list of who came to the ranch and why, and I kept it because that was how property survived. "I don't harbor fugitives." The man's mouth tightened. "I figured that," he said. "Just need a corner. I'll be gone before dawn." There were 1,000 reasons to shut the barn door. Harper had eyes in more places than a bad rumor. Sheltering someone liable to bring the Marshal's attention back would be like stapling a wanted poster to my door. But there was something in the way he held himself. An old injury wrapped in leather, a limp that kept him favoring one shoulder. It spoke of being hunted for reasons that were not entirely criminal fancy. Also, there was the practical fact that my barn had a stall cleared where I kept a bale for the winter's worst. People have survived because someone with a heavier heart chose a small mercy. "You'll make noise," I told him. "You'll wake the horses. You'll not go near the house. You keep to yourself and don't sleep in the hay with the mares. They bite." He offered me a crooked smile. "Noted. Name's Jonah Mercer." I fumbled my hand into his, the way I used to find Sam's in the dark. Jonah's palm was scarred, the lines telling a story I hadn't asked for but could read anyway. A life of hard choices, hands used for trouble and for work. Maggie Wren, this is my place. He didn't question why I would risk my neck for the sake of a man he did not know. He didn't offer to bribe me or threaten me. His eyes paused in a way that asked if I knew what I was doing. That pause, respect, was the only guarantee I had he'd keep his word. Marshals came in the morning, as they always do after a storm or a spooked informant. I could tell by the stamp of boots on the dirt road and the thinness of their voices that they were not there for a friendly visit. I spoke crisply to the deputy who approached, named prices and names and stories that would make their search go more slowly than it needed to. When they peered into the barn, the hay looked unperturbed. When they asked me about strangers, I said I had none. Lies are a kind of necessary skin when you are protecting the ones beneath. It was the small, private decision, the choice to keep a stranger when I could have handed him to a marshal for a promise of favors, that broke the neatness of my life open. It was not a romantic or heroic act. It was a practical one cut from a cloth of solidarity I felt for people who were hunted for the truths they might tell. Perhaps a part of me thought Jonah Mercer might be another troublemaker with a story to sell until the night I caught him tracing the river on an old map with his finger, lips moving in the silence like someone remembering scripture. When he looked up, he met the terrible, stubborn grief in me and did not flinch. That was when I realized there were reasons a person could be pursued by the law that had nothing to do with guilt. I whispered, not to him, but to myself, I will not be taken twice. The marshal had taken my husband. He would not take my life, or my land, or the pieces of dignity I'd stitched together out of mourning. If keeping a stranger in a cold stall would mean I could buy time to find the ledger that proved Sam had been blackmailed, if it meant the marshal had to prove again that he had a moral spine rather than a front for greed, then so be it. I had a skill no one expected, stubborn endurance wrapped in practical competence. I would use it. Jonah slept like a man who'd learned to sleep in half-minute increments. He left a shoe by the door, and when dawn came and the deputy called again, my voice was steady, my answers measured. I had done a dangerous thing. I had also done a necessary one. When the marshal's men had moved off in their dust trail, I looked at the stall where Jonah had been and felt, for the first time in years, a flicker at the center of my chest that was not just the hardness of grief. It was the beginning of a plan. The alliance between a widow with a ledger and an outlaw with a limp had no legend in it at the start, just the blunt business of surviving. I fed Jonah the same stew I gave to the hands in harvest, a simple thing with more barley than meat. He ate with the measured gratitude of a man who hasn't known a warm meal for days. We spoke in the thin light of the kitchen. He told me he was on the run from Elias Harper, and the name struck me like a slap. Then Jonah's words began to slide into the place where my own grief sat. Harper's not a simple marshal, he said, his voice low as the embers. He keeps lists. Names that inconvenience him end up gone, or they end up with the wrong charges. I knew a man in Denton who tried to stand up to him. Next thing, the man was labeled a rustler and they took his land. My jaw clenched. The memory of Sam arguing with Harper about the county route changes pulled up like a wound. He did that to my husband, I said. Sam said Harper was funneling cattle to certain buyers. Sam argued he had evidence, ledgers, notes. 2 months later, Harper shot him in town and called it self-defense. Jonah's hand closed around his cup as if it were a thing that could anchor him. I ran because I saw too much, because I had a reason they wanted off the board. He did not say why Harper was after him. People like Harper have ways of making the worst parts unsaid. Threats, insinuations, a look that says cooperation is survival. Jonah's silence folded around that absence like a cloak. We could have been strangers passing in the night. Instead, we found the small, binding business of mutual usefulness. He had something to give me beyond danger. Knowledge. He had rode with men who spoke of bribes and routes. He knew the marshal's rotation, the men who took sheep in the night for the bargain price of silence. I had my ledgers and my practical ways of making an argument stick. Receipts, correspondence, Sam's careful handwriting. If there was any truth to be extracted from Harper's tidy lies, it would be in paper and witness. The first test came that night when the marshals returned with more than curiosity. A deputy, a younger man with a soft face, came to ask questions I'd already refused to answer. He loitered at the gate as if he understood the shape of our land better than I did. Property in this county had always been a showpiece for men's assumptions. Jonah watched me from the corner, his eyes a steady weight. Then he leaned forward and said casually, as if he had no more than a professional interest in our conversation, "Reckon Miss Wren has hay to trade. I heard she's got the best in the valley." It was a small thing, an assertion of value that the deputy could not deny. He warmed at the chance to be useful and found himself out on the road, hauling an order that gave me an hour to move Sam's ledger box from under the false bottom of the pantry into the stall where Jonah slept. I slid paper after paper into Jonah's satchel, my hands moving like a machine made of memory. Each slip of accounts was a stitch on the seam of my future. When the men came back to the gate that day, they came less suspicious and more hungry. We had trade. We had a reason to be left alone. Jonah's quiet interventions shifted suspicion from me because he understood how to shape a story without lying outright. He appealed to the deputy's appetite for a simple transaction. It was skill, not deceit, and it earned my respect. Under the low rafters of the barn, I learned Jonah's particular competencies. He had been a scout, a man who could read the land and the lines men left like footprints on a map. He could travel light, pick a lock, make a saddle where none seemed to exist. He was careful with animals, and he could coax a broken colt with patience that matched my own. Most importantly, Jonah understood the unspoken rules of men who ran on the edges of the law. He taught me how to listen when silence was a language being used against us. I taught him how to bind a wound, how to read a ledger, and how to speak to a farmer without sounding like a city thief. There is something intimate about teaching someone to tie a knot that will hold a seam. It requires patience and trust. In that shared attention, a fragile loyalty began to form, one built less of romantic longing and more of the mutual respect that comes from watching someone do the things that protect life. We practiced stories to tell when the townsfolk looked at us sideways. I sharpened Jonah's manners for public exchange. He taught me to ride faster than I had in years. He grew steadier in his smile. I grew harder in my resolve. Between the two of us, we made a life less precarious and more possible. And always, in the hush after chores, when Jonah traced nothing on the map and I counted the ledgers twice, there was an undercurrent, an agreement that we would not let Elias Harper dictate the course of my life or his. The alliance was unlikely because it defied the neat boxes people liked, the protective man and the helpless woman. It became something else entirely. We were each shelter and weapon for the other, an imbalance corrected by mutual skill. He was not my rescue. He was my partner in a plan I intended to lead. There is a kind of healing that arrives in the small, stubborn motion of daily work. After the immediate danger passed, the slow knitting back together of life at the ranch taught me that strength is often the patient accumulation of tiny certainties. A fence mended before the rain, a herd counted twice, a ledger that finally matches the pockets of middlemen who'd been skimming the edges. In the quiet aftermath of that first storm, I began to rebuild with intent. My specialty had always been medicine, midwifery, and a knack for tending the wounds of both beast and human. Before I married Sam, I'd apprenticed under a woman named Hattie, who taught me how to read an infection before it announced itself in fever. The county had no surgeon worth the name. Women in the valley came to me because they had to. I had become an unheralded kind of indispensable, because the world would sooner die than shift its assumptions about who was competent. For years, I had used that competence to hold a county together in small private ways. Now I would use it to hold myself together. When Jonah first watched me set a fractured wrist with nothing but homemade splints, and later, a careful stitch that left a neat scar, his expression softened in a way that made me notice him more sharply. "You keep people stitched together," he said once, after we'd bound a hired hand's foot. "You could be a town's backbone." I laughed at that. Backbone was not what I'd been. Sam and I had been partners, yes, equal in our routine, but the truth was I'd been taught to swallow my voice so that the world could continue in its narrower shape. I had been protective, but protective in ways that disguised my own needs. The loss of Sam made that both impossible and necessary to change. With Jonah's help, I began to widen the business side of the ranch. Sam's ledger was a map of small betrayals. A man in the next county ordering hay and skimming part of the payment, a local merchant delivering poor grain and charging twice. Armed with evidence, we appealed to the one place Harper could not immediately script: the people. Farmers talk, and they keep grudges. We began attending the market with receipts and invoices and the quiet confidence of someone who knows her numbers. A widow in the lead, surprising for the men used to counting on their own judgment. I organized a ledger club in the parlor on Thursday nights. Women from 3 farms came, Ruth from 2 miles down with a cough that never let her forget her weakness, Ida, who sold eggs at the market and had a laugh that startled birds, and Mary Ellis, who had lost 2 sons to Harper's sweeping enforcements, and now sewed quilts with a needle quicker than any of us could keep up. They brought tea and anecdotes, and together we read receipts and plotted what the law could not grant us: leverage. Female solidarity, I learned, starts at the elbow where the work is done. We made plans not of revolution but of resistance. If votes were stacked against us, the economy could be a blunt instrument. If a buyer refused to take our stock at fair price, we contrived to find another buyer. If Harper had his cronies buying our cattle, we kept smaller herds and sold to the rail stop, where men did not know Harper's face. We banded our resources in a way that was quiet but effective, pooling feed, sharing a woman to watch calves when someone had to travel for court. Practicalities built out into a community that, like any good medicine, was applied where it mattered most. I found my voice not in the town square at first, but in the ledger pages and in the way I taught a woman to keep her receipts balanced. When Ruth realized she could prove the man who bought her eggs had been shorting her, and when she walked in town with that proof like a banner, it felt like a small revolution. I had taught her a skill that made her less apt to be prey. That is power, the ability to make someone else's life steadier. Jonah watched these things and changed in the ways little men change when they see a woman standing up and refusing to be moved. He listened to my plans for purchasing a small piece of additional land. Sam's name on the deed had made sale complicated, and I was determined to find a way to secure our house and the fields. His help was tactical. He'd slip into town at odd hours and ask the right people about buyers, bankers, and deputies. He was not trying to be my savior. He was being a resource, a man who respected that this was my battle. There were nights when the grief crept in, when the parlor's silence amplified the absence like a drum. I would find Jonah in the barn, tracing the curve of a saddle horn or staring at the stars as if they might provide instructions. He did not press me for confession or counsel. Instead, he offered a steadiness in labor. He would sit by the well while I filled the pails until the light had gone from the sky, and that quiet became an anchor. As the weeks moved, strangers began to notice the rhythm of the place. The children on the road learned to hitch their ponies to the post and ask for my advice. A widow from across the range came with a fever and left with a recipe for an herbal poultice and a promise to return with her own ledger this Thursday. The small things added up. Buyers who respected paperwork, a deputy who learned the shape of the farm, the bank that underestimated my stubbornness at their peril. Strength, I came to understand, is not only the moment of defiance when you stand in front of a man with a badge and refuse to be moved. It is also the quiet accumulation of competence and the making of a life that is harder to take. I was learning to stitch not only wounds, but the seams of a future. If Jonah brought a knowledge of men on the run, he also carried a past that could be shaped into tools for my fight. When a person has lived outside the tidy lines society draws, he has learned to notice edges, where the law is porous, where the marshal's reach thins, where a bribe will buy a favor for a night but not for a ledger. Jonah's past did not become my center. It served my purpose. He did not tell tales to impress. He spoke when I needed the facts. One afternoon, as we sat with a kettle between us and the horses lowed in the distance, Jonah told me the story of why Elias Harper had taken to hunting men like him. He spoke of a deal gone wrong years before, a route that paid better if the marshal looked the other way when cattle moved in the dark. Someone had tried to blow the whistle. Harper, who'd been a deputy then, had used his authority to silence trouble. The man who had tried to expose him was found dead at the river. The coroner had called it an accident. Harper had a hand in a lot of things, Jonah said. He knew how to make an accident look godly. Folks who tried to expose him were sometimes made examples of. The speech was a map. I asked the sharp questions. Names, dates, places. Jonah gave them like a man handing over a key. Slow, careful, because the key could lock him up if dropped in the wrong place. He told me names of men who'd been paid off and of a ledger he'd once seen that cataloged bribes. It was the kind of ledger the honest would never have, figures squirreled away in a sea of doctored accounts. He'd seen it once at a staging house near Denton. He remembered the owner, a quiet man named Garrity who had since gone missing. Why stick your neck out? I demanded. Why not go far and never look back? Jonah's face was a map of choices. Because some things deserve to be righted, he said simply. Because I can't run forever and because I saw a woman, Mary Ellis, go to Harper and lose her home. Because sometimes you can't keep your hands clean when men like him are doing the dirty work. This was not the pained confession of a romantic hero. It was the pragmatic arithmetic of a man who had seen crooked ledgers and found them intolerable. He had skills I needed. Knowledge of Harper's roots, the men who sold him cattle quietly, the hideouts used to stash evidence. He did not offer them as gifts. He offered them as capital to trade for safety and the chance at a new life. I decided how to use them. The plan did not require Jonah to become a martyr. It required him to become an instrument of exposure. We would find the ledger Garrity, had kept. We would find witnesses who could stand in court and tell a truth that Harper's men couldn't carve out of them with threats. We would use Jonah's knowledge to outmaneuver Harper's comfortable assumptions about who could be trusted and who could be bought. He was not only my instrument. As we worked, he revealed weaknesses of his own. Men who live by their wits often lose simple things: an evening at a kitchen table with a proper cup of tea, the pleasure of a named bed rather than a rolled blanket. He admitted once, with that crooked smile that had become more familiar, that he had lost the ability to imagine a future where he was not being chased. I told him then, in my bluntness, that he could choose differently. You aren't owed anything, I said. But if you choose to stand and help, you'll find a life you can keep. He looked into my face the way a man considers a map. I never expected to meet a woman who'd tell me to stand and then hand me the tools, he said. Most ask me to be a soldier or a janitor of their mistakes. He searched for the word. You ask for partnership. That word, partnership, matters. There's a difference between being offered a banister to cling to and being handed a plow. Jonah's past, seamed and rough, fit into my life the way a good tool fits a calloused hand. He knew where the enemy was vulnerable. I knew which civic nerve to press. My moral compass led. Jonah's experience made the path possible. We did not set traps because we wanted blood. We set them because truth needs more than the law in a place where law is bought. We used his knowledge to trace the chain of sales that led to Harper's allies. We followed the money because men like Harper wrapped their hands in coin, and sometimes the trail of coin is easier to see than the trail of lies. Where Harper had used fear and a badge to close doors, we would pry them open with ledger entries and witnesses ready to speak. I was surprised at how readily other people answered when I asked. Women who had once believed the Marshal's clean story now admitted to seeing men at odd hours loading cattle into wagons. A blacksmith confessed he'd mended a harness that had been used in a midnight run. A clerk in town revealed that Harper had an account in his ledger that never appeared in county books. Each small confession fed the larger pattern until it looked less like rumor and more like evidence. Jonah's outlaw past became a resource without overshadowing my agency. He did not become the hero who saved me. He became the person whose skills made my work possible. He knew where Harper's men moved, and I knew how to place the accusation so that people would listen. In that way, our stories served each other, and more important, they served the truth. If I had thought my grief would soften into acceptance, Elias Harper's cruelly arranged neatness had other plans. My fight was not born of anger alone. It came from a place of abiding fairness. Sam had been robbed of a life and called a criminal, and the world had acted as if that tidy sentence was enough. I could not let that be how his name ended. The ledger I'd kept with Sam's handwriting contained clauses and notes that mattered. There were dispatch ledger notes, dates when certain herds were moved without proper sale, receipts with names that did not belong to the men who signed them. One particular entry made my blood ice, a cryptic note about a payment to E.H. It was a thing small enough to be buried in decades of transactions, but in that small script was the exact coin trail we needed. It connected Harper to a man named Calloway, a cattle buyer in Denton, a man I had always liked for the straightness of his jaw. The world likes faces it recognizes. I could feel the shape of my purpose like a thing wrapped around my ribs. It was not solely vengeance, it was refusal. The county would be forced to look at the facts if I pushed them hard enough and from the right direction. I did not want men like Harper to be free to decide who lived and who died. Jonah listened to me plan with a patience that was almost priestly. He did not try to hijack the mission. He asked the right questions about timing and contact. Who could be trusted to carry a ledger? Who would risk signing a deposition in a town where Harper's men had friends? He had a sense for the human parts of a plan, the fear, the hunger for a normal life, the small favors owed among neighbors that could be paid back in the currency of courage. He reminded me that courage is contagious when it is led. I drew up my own list of risks. There were men in town who made a living from their willingness to be Harper's muscle. There were deputies who took warm cups and warmer coin. There were witnesses whose livelihoods depended on Harper's silence. But there were other things, binders of receipts, women who kept watch, and a slow accumulation of small truths that, when placed together, looked like a projectable pattern. One night, as black as the backs of ravens, I packed my satchel with copies of every ledger page I could make and a map Jonah had drawn with the places where Harper's men tended to pass. We rode to Denton, careful as ghosts. The thing many people forget about pursuing justice is that it requires patience, and the acceptance you will be bored before you are victorious. We took the slow path, made conversations with old merchants, and, crucially, we found Garrity's old staging house. The house was no longer a staging house, only a rotting memory of one, a place where men passed through and left names like graffiti. I picked my way inside and found, under a loose plank in the storeroom, a small box wrapped in oilcloth. My hands did not tremble as I opened it. Inside lay a ledger, less a poetic truth than a dry record of bribes and payments. It was not the sprawling, neat log I had imagined. It was splintered, messy, and real. On the drive back, with the ledger hidden under a bale of hay, I thought about the face Harper had made when he called Sam a regrettable element. He'd believed his own rhetoric long enough to imagine himself beyond reproach. My goal was not to humiliate him for the sake of a meanness. It was to make sure he could no longer pattern the county with his violence. I wanted the law to act like what it pretended to be. We needed witnesses. Garrity had been the keeper of lists, and he had gone missing. But there were others. There was Mary Ellis, who had lost her sons. There was a blacksmith who had mended harnesses used in midnight runs. There was a deputy's wife who'd seen her husband's pockets bulge the night Harper paid him. Women, again, were where truth nested. They noticed details men dismissed. I tapped them. I coaxed them with the promise of safety and the practical work of keeping households running. They joined grudgingly, then with fierce resolve. I had to be careful to hold the helm. Not because Jonah could not lead, but because this was my decision. He did not resent it. He offered tactical advice and when the time came, took the risk of riding into town under a borrowed guise to plant an inquiry and misdirect prying men. The work required coordination and a willingness to accept uncomfortable means, like blackmail in reverse, threatening to expose the mercenaries who'd been paid to lie if they did not instead sign a confession. I learned to move through the world with a new kind of boldness. I went to the county clerk with a spine that had not existed before. I pushed papers across a desk and told a story of ledger pages and missing men. I asked for a public inquiry. They laughed at me. But laughter bounces away from things that are built on paper. Paper is a stubborn thing. The hardest part of my fight was not in the ledger or in the confrontations. It was in asking people to risk their homes, their reputations, and their lives. It was in walking into Mary Ellis's kitchen and saying, "Will you speak? Because if you don't, they'll keep killing us and calling it weather." Mary looked at me as if she read the question and the risk. She had already lost 2 sons. What more could be asked of her? She put a knife into the bread and signed her name without hesitation. I cried then privately, not because I wanted grief, but because the grief had been converted into courage in a way that felt sacred. Harper would call our actions foolish. He would say we were stirring up ghosts. We were stirring up truth. The difference mattered. Partnership is a work of constant negotiation. It is not a single story where one person hands another a key and the rest is gratitude. It is a daily rearrangement of responsibilities, respect, and the hard, unromantic labor of compromise. Jonah and I found our rhythm by deciding together on the small and large matters. He would not run off to act without my consent, and I would not plan without considering his safety. In that balance, a bond of equals formed. We began to coordinate with precision. Jonah's knowledge of Harper's men allowed us to schedule when evidence could be most safely moved and when witnesses could be offered shelter. I handled the paperwork, the accounts, and the persuasion needed to move a man to testimony. The days when I taught a woman how to keep receipts were the same days Jonah shadowed a deputy to discover who took money. It was deliberate division of labor that honored both our strengths. He learned to sit in a kitchen while I spoke to a woman who had been scared into silence, and he learned the delicate etiquette of being present without being threatening. He watched me at meetings and learned how to make a point without showing the clenched fist behind it. He learned that a man who listens and honors a woman's leadership tends to find a better life than one who demands it. He understood that our mission needed the moral clarity I offered and the practical discretion he had. I learned from him too. Jonah taught me how to read a man's eyes for telltale signs, the flinch at the mention of a name, the tiny cough that is actually a signal. He taught me a kind of battlefield economy, the art of misdirection when you could not afford confrontation. He taught me to be less trusting of smooth rhetoric and more trusting of the women who watch the comings and goings of men with a hawk's gaze. He showed me a way to be brave that was quiet and not ostentatious. There was tenderness in the way we supported one another. It came not in grand declarations, but in the small acts that make ordinary life possible. An extra log for the stove when I had stayed up late copying ledger pages, a bandage applied to a blister after a long ride, a hand on my shoulder when I stared at Sam's empty chair and felt like I might fold. He did not offer to shoulder my grief as if it were his to carry. He offered his presence as a place where grief could be held. That distinction mattered. Romance crept in like a slow tide, changing the shape of the shore without erasing the land. It was not the sudden lighting of fireworks. It was the mutual recognition of worth. We argued like equals, over strategy, over the ethics of taking certain risks. But those arguments ended in strategy, rather than in one person being diminished. I remember a particular night when we sat on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, the sky a thin black sheet embroidered with stars. Jonah reached for my hand and said simply, "You make me want to be more than my past." I did not tell him he was redeemable because he asked. I told him because I had watched him be better for his own decisions. When a man changes because he sees a life he'd like to keep, the change is real. He was gentled not by romance, but by the steadying work of purpose. He was not mine to fix. He was a man who chose to walk at my side. We took small vacations, rides with no leisure to unpack, afternoons spent mending a fence together. There were moments of laughter that felt like therapy. I taught him a recipe Sam had loved, stew with more onions and the smell of thyme, and he learned to set the table without the air of a man uncomfortable in domestic life. Those acts mattered, not because they made us a conventional couple, but because they showed that partnership is made of shared burdens and shared joys. There were also arguments. Once Jonah rode into town without telling me because there was a rumor Harper had doubled his deputies. I was furious. He had unnecessarily endangered himself. He apologized, not with groveling words, but with a plan to remove risk where he'd created it. He learned to check in. I learned to delegate more. We adapted. Equality is not an achievement. It is an ongoing conversation. As our partnership solidified, we found ourselves healing in the ways that matter most, by becoming the kinds of people who could be counted on. I became less afraid to ask for help. He became less likely to assume violence was the only answer. We were not perfect. We made mistakes. But we were deliberate about our growth, and deliberate about grounding our affection in respect. Every plan reaches a precipice. The instant where you look over the edge and choose which end you'll throw your weight toward. Safety or justice. For months, I'd balanced on that edge, counting witnesses and signatures like a woman counting her beads before prayer. The moment came on a morning that felt like a confession. The sky a low, hard gray and the land smelling of wet earth. We had gathered enough to force a county hearing. Garrity's ledger had been authenticated by a clerk who had the courage of a woman who'd lost a son in earlier improprieties. Mary Ellis and the blacksmith had agreed to testify. The papers were backed with records, and the line of bribes traced a path straight to Elias Harper. The county judge, a man not particularly known for his courage, had scheduled a hearing. It would be public. Harper would appear with his badge and with the men who made his projects possible. I stood in the parlor, Sam's chair still creaking in memory, and thought about the life I might choose. There were two images in my head. One was a quiet one, a smaller herd, less attention from town, the ability to live out my days making bread and delivering babies, a porch with 2 rocking chairs, and the occasional visit from a man who could be my companion in equal measure. The other image was a loud one, a town that changed because a woman refused to be quiet, a county that could not be purchased by a badge. Both were desirable. Both were dangerous in their own way. Jonah made no argument for my choosing one over the other. He sat on the stoop and watched me like a man watching the tide. He knew the stakes. He also knew that whatever I chose, he would be there. That was the quality of the partnership. No pressure, only presence. I thought of the women who'd given me their trust. Ruth with her cough, Ida with her eggs, Mary with her grief. I thought of the ledger pages folded into Jonah's satchel. I thought of the ways Harper's men had taken not just property, but dignity from the people who worked their land. I thought of Sam's voice in the kitchen, the way he had once said, "You get one life, Margaret. Make it count." It wasn't a romantic command. It was a practical one. Sam believed in the small virtues of a life lived with purpose. We sat quietly, mapping the hearings in silence. There was a table of options: rely on the county to do its duty and risk Harper pulling a favor, bring in women as a force, call in witnesses at once to avoid individual coercion, make the hearing loud with public scrutiny so Harper could not tuck the truth into a closed room. Each option had weight. Finally, I made my choice. We bring people, I said, all at once. We make it impossible for Harper to pick them off one by one. We will not give him the time to threaten them in the dark. Jonah's mouth tightened in the way I've come to learn means grim agreement. We go public, he said. We bring every woman and every man who will stand. We imagined a future in which justice prevailed, and we returned to the subtle pleasures of life on the ranch. We imagined, too, a life where we built something together on terms neither of us had before. A relationship of equals, where he would not be the man who rescued me and I would not be the woman who needed rescuing. We shared our little visions, an orchard, a schoolhouse with a teacher who was compensated fairly, until our imaginations made a map that was almost plan. The calm hammered in the pause before the storm. I had made a choice that was mine. It was an active, deliberate choice to risk safety for the possibility of a future not dictated by Harper's greed. Jonah kissed my hand then, lightly, with a promise rather than possessiveness. That gesture alone was proof he respected my agency. His faith in me steadied me, but it did not make my decision for me. I had chosen hard. I had chosen justice. And in that choice, I had declared that my life, my decisions, were not for him to accept or refuse. They were mine to make. When you decide to rattle a nest of vipers, expect a swarm. Elias Harper did what tyrants do when the law looks like a mirror reflecting their crimes. He struck back. Word spread through the county like wildfire fed on starved ground. Deputies who had been lukewarm at the idea of opposing him found their courage bent by promises and, more dangerously, their loyalty bought by threats. Harper's men began to make the rounds of the witnesses, appearing at odd hours with offers of money and poisonous smiles. They suggested settlements and sensible arrangements, and made words like stability sound like locks. The first direct blow came when one of our witnesses, a quiet man named Paul who had seen cattle loaded at Harper's order, took a bribe and then disappeared. We found his horse at the river with the saddle tossed aside as if he'd been taken quickly, and a woman's shredded shawl nearby. The deputy who had promised to watch over witnesses came to me in a panic and begged for my help. Men used to be the ones to protect. Now it was the women who stepped forward. I refused to be intimidated. We doubled down. I took the decision that would make Harper's attempts to pick us off fruitless. We organized a caravan of witnesses who would all go to the hearing together. We made the town square a stage by announcing the time and inviting every soul who would listen. When power prefers shadow, the sun is a weapon. Jonah took the more dangerous work. He kept Harper's eyes diverted. He visited the saloons Harper's men favored, with the pretense of seeking work. He listened. He reported back with details about who had been paid off and who might still be persuadable. He prowled in a way that was precise, not reckless, and brought me the kind of intelligence I could act on with paperwork and persuasion. Harper grew desperate. He sent men to intimidate Mary Ellis, to threaten the blacksmith. He made a public spectacle of law by arresting a man downtown on a trumped-up charge. The message was clear. If you try to unseat me, I will make you uncomfortable in ways that feel inevitably smaller than death, but are large enough to break livelihoods. We turned Harper's tactics back on him. Where he expected fear and compliance, we delivered exposure and solidarity. We brought the Women's Club public with flyers and testimony. We engaged the county newspaper, a man with a conscience and a slow typewriter, who found in the ledger pages his own appetite for truth. He refused to print everything at once, but he printed enough to make people begin to put pieces together. When a deputy arrested a man to silence him, we already had the clerk's copy of Garrity's ledger and a butcher shop owner willing to testify about odd deliveries. It became harder to claim accidents when there was a trail of invoices to back up accusation. Harper took another step that was meant to frighten. He petitioned the court to take the ranch temporarily due to evidence that linked me to criminal activity. He used the very language he had used to crush others. He turned the law's own face to his advantage. We were faced with a judge who was comfortable bending precedent when it suited him. If he succeeded, all our work would be rendered moot. The county's legal machinery, which should have protected us, used its own cogs to oppress. I did not crumble. Instead, I slammed back with paperwork and witnesses and with the kind of practical, unglamorous 1-2 punch that men who fancy themselves above the rules rarely anticipate. I filed counterclaims, sent notices of our evidence to every man at the county seat, and rallied the women to come to the hearing as a united front. It was a risky gamble. Harper could escalate to violence, but the alternative was to grant him permission to make the county his private fiefdom. The night before the hearing, Harper's men came to the house and set a brush fire along the north fence. It was sloppy and small, meant to send a message. I woke to the smell of smoke and the panicked whinny of a young mare and roused the small band of women who had been sleeping at the ranch for safety. They worked like devils, beating at the flames with wet sacks. We saved most of the herd by sheer animal determination and sweat. The fire scorched a line of fence, and when dawn came, we found footprints that leaned toward town more than away from it. Harper had miscalculated my community's resolve. The fire had angered them in a way that stitched them closer. The women, who had once been cautious about becoming embroiled in men's fights, now stood with their sleeves rolled. Ruth spoke at the church rally and told a story of a man whose son had been in Sam's company the night he died. The crowd that had once nodded politely now listened with sharpened attention. Jonah and I spent that night mapping contingency plans and ensuring the witnesses were safe. He sat by the stove and sharpened a knife in silence. The act a private kind of ritual. I realized he was preparing for the worst, not because he assumed violence would be the answer, but because he refused to be helpless. That steadied me. Forces had conspired around us, a net cast by a man who believed himself immune to consequence. But all nets have holes. The holes are the people who refuse to be afraid. We plugged them with courage and planning, and assembled our witnesses like a jury before the judge. We would go into the hearing with strength and with the stubbornness of those who had no other choice. Even the best-laid plans bow before the unexpected. On the morning of the hearing, when dawn broke thin and pale, I felt a thrumming of nerves like a horse before a thunderstorm. The county hall filled with people, neighbors, skeptical men, and women in dresses that had been stitched up for their courage. We had assembled our witnesses, our ledgers, and a small but undeniable army of citizens who no longer wished to be governed by fear. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything trembled. A deputy arrived in the square with Jonah in chains. He had been taken the night before, caught in a trap laid by Harper's men when he'd tried to secure another witness. The sight of him, blood at his temple, his hands raw against iron, was a blow that cracked the air. My knees nearly gave beneath me. The marshal demanded Jonah be held as a suspect. He spun a tale of theft, of confiscated evidence. The gathering shivered, pushed between our case for justice and the raw spectacle of a man standing accused of being an outlaw. For a moment, I felt my skin peel back from my bones. If the townspeople believed Harper's frame, they might abandon us. Jonah had been our linchpin in many ways. His knowledge of Harper's men gave us tactical advantage. His satchel contained copies of the ledger we could not yet risk exposing. Without him, we had fewer options. I forced my jaw to set. Panic was useless. I had trained myself to act under pressure. Midwives do this all the time, holding a hand under a head about to be born while the world anxiously awaits. I would not let this be the day my chest gave in. I moved to the county judge and reminded him, firmly, coldly, of the ledger's existence and of the names on its pages. I told him plainly, "You will not let a man who has sworn to seek the truth be turned into a scapegoat because his testimony embarrasses the sheriff." My voice was not strident. It was a weapon honed to necessity. The judge, a man who'd always preferred the security of precedent to courage, hesitated. Harper smiled like a man who had finally trapped his prey. Several men in the crowd muttered about law and the need to accept official accounts. It felt like the room might tilt. Then Mary Ellis stepped forward. Her voice, which had been a soft thing in the church, became a blade. She walked to the stand and recounted the night her boys had gone missing, the way Harper had been seen near their property the same week. She spoke of how Harper had called her a liar, and the way the town had rallied to his side because it made them safe. Her words were steady, honed by loss. Others followed. The blacksmith testified to harnesses at night. The butcher corroborated the ledger's entries. Witnesses we had expected to waver did not. They had seen what fear did when left unchecked, and they refused to let that law stand. But Harper, clever and vicious, had another trick. He'd procured a writ that would temporarily seize my property on the pretext of evidence preservation. It was signed by a judge under his influence and was brutal in its efficiency. Deputies arrived with a posse and began to mark the house with official ribbon. The crowd that had once been our ally found it easier to step back when deputies had paper in their hands and the law seemed to tilt toward authority. I watched men with feelings like the rest of us, some of them my neighbors, turn away, their faces set against involvement. My throat closed. There are moments when everything you have built seems to slide like stones on a path. You can feel the ground give underfoot. That's when I understood what this fight would require of me. It would require the worst of me, the part that does not flinch at being alone. I had a choice. Let Harper take what he wanted, believing I could heal from lesser wounds, or make a stand. For better or worse, I chose to stand. I mobilized the women. We took the county clerk's office step by step, filing paperwork that questioned the writ's legality. We rallied to the square and told the crowd Harper's ledger existed, and that the owner of the ledger had been threatened. We made noise. The key was to make the theft of my property a political act rather than a private one. Harper had weaponized the law. We weaponized public opinion and the stubborn truth. There was also the matter of Jonah. I could not let him be the sacrificial pawn in Harper's game. I sent Ruth and Ida to fetch Garrity's closest friend from Denton, a man who owed Garrity a favor and who would speak of Harper's dealings if only he were assured of safety. At the risk of exposing more men to Harper's reach, I organized a small covert plan to spirit Jonah from the deputy's minimal guard. It was a dangerous gambit. If it failed, we would lose everything. If it succeeded, we might still salvage the hearing. We moved the way a woman who has learned that risk is the currency of justice moves, with careful, practical steps. We cut the drapes in the judge's office to make room for the number of witnesses coming forward. We delivered ledgers under the nose of the county clerk and staged our witness to arrive all at once so they couldn't be taken individually. It was ugly and illegal in some ways. It was also necessary. In the darkest hour, when Harper's men were at their most confident, I found a small, luminous thing, the resolve of a community that had had enough. It wouldn't be clean. It would cost us. But I was not the sort of woman who fled from the price of speaking truth. I had been rocked by sorrow enough times to know that some things are worth paying for. When you stand in the hollow of a storm, your real work is not to pray for a calm, but to build the wind into something that carries you. That morning, we turned our fear into action. I had a plan, one not born of bravado, but of the accumulation of days in which small things had been gathered and cataloged. We would not simply challenge Harper with words and ledgers. We would make visible the network of men who benefited from his rule. We would use their greed to drag their complicity into light. The strategy was granular. First, we needed Jonah back in play. He was being held at the jail on a charge Harper concocted. The deputy in charge of the jail was a man with a weakness for wagers and for the kind of woman who paid him attention. Ida, who knew people's weaknesses in an almost spiritual way, visited him with a pie and a story about her sick child who needed a certain medicine only available in Denton. The deputy, compromised by his own needs, agreed to escort her child as a favor, and in doing so left his post with a minimal guard. In the shuffle, Jonah's small chance to move presented itself. We moved quickly. Ruth and I crept into the jail at the crack of dawn with a map and enough confidence to startle men who had estimated we would be cowed. Jonah slipped out between shifts like a shadow returning from exile. He was raw and hungry, but alive. When he came to my porch and placed his calloused hand on my shoulder, it was like a benediction. "You did this," he breathed. It was not a victory, but a rebalancing. We still had the hearing, but with Jonah free, we could move with more strategy. We positioned women at the edges of the county seat, the market women, the stable boys' mothers, the midwives, so that if Harper tried anything overt, the town would know. Word is a fast horse when ridden. On the day of the hearing, the town square filled as if to watch an execution. Harper stood there, gilded by his badge, with men who looked as if they were waiting to be paid. I stood with Mary Ellis and the blacksmith and the clerk, and with the women who had been rougher in their convictions than any man who depended on Harper's coin. We were a motley force, and still we looked like the better argument. I took the stand with Jonah at my side, not as a protector, but as a witness to the truth. I read aloud from the ledger pages, my voice steady, the figures a dry, necessary litany of payments and names. Each name that fell from my lips pried at a scab on the town's face. Men frowned, deputies shifted, and Harper's smugness thinned. Then, in a moment that had been hard-bought, the county clerk stood up and threw his office weight behind us, confirming the ledger's authenticity. The room quieted as if the law itself were holding its breath. Witnesses testified in that hour, men and women who had, in bits, been bought or threatened into silence. They spoke of nights they had seen men with Harper, and of deals that stank. There was no poetry in what they said, only the trudge of fact. Facts are boring until they become undeniable. Harper raged, of course. He accused us of conspiracy and of turning the town against him. He tried to twist our words. But the ledger was real, and the ledger had witnesses. The judge, who had once leaned toward expedience, found himself cornered by a public that demanded proper proceedings. He ordered an investigation and temporarily suspended Harper pending results. He could not, in the face of a crowd and a paper trail, continue to act as if Harper's authority were absolute. When the Marshal's suspension came through, it did not feel like the triumphant music of a movie. It felt like a long breath released. Justice is rarely swift or cinematic. It is often a small, precise instrument used in the right place at the right time. In the aftermath, men who had profited from Harper's protection found themselves exposed. Some fled. Others quietly made payment plans with those they'd stolen from. It was, in its own way, a messy reordering. For me, the important thing was that I had led the charge. I had chosen the risk and taken steps to protect those who trusted me. Jonah had been beside me not as a shield but as a partner. The romance that had threaded through our struggle warmed into something more permanent in the months that followed. It was not an eclipse that swallowed my independence. It was the slow coalescence of two people who had chosen to shoulder a life together. We argued, we planned, we farmed, we kept each other's secrets and sharpened each other's talents. At the center of it all, the women who had stood with me became a new sort of society. We formed a cooperative of sorts, pooling resources, trading services for livestock, and teaching each other skills from ledger keeping to midwifery. We created a small network of power that made us less vulnerable. The board of the local school soon came to me asking if I'd teach basic literacy and accounting to the children, an offer I accepted with the stubborn pleasure of someone who knows how much a pencil can change a life. The community's rebalance did not happen overnight. There were men who sought vengeance and deputies who tried to resettle the narrative. But the tide had shifted. Elias Harper would be dealt with by the law, finally forced into a process that could not be softened by his gold. He would face a trial fueled by the very evidence he had thought erased. Justice, when it arrives after long labor, is more like the slow unrolling of a map than a sudden dawn. Harper's trial came in the late summer, the courthouse heavy with the smell of baked earth and the iron tang of many people's hopes. He wore his uniform as if it were a second skin. He tried to hold his face like a man untouched by scandal. But the ledger that had been bundled with care in my chest and then authenticated by others was a stubborn thing. The trial lasted a week. Witnesses came with quiet courage and tremulous hands, and many men found their voices steadier than they'd expected when the story was no longer theirs alone. There were days when I sat in the back of the courtroom, Jonah's fingers entwined with mine under the bench, and felt the world tilt in a way that made air feel less like a thing to breathe and more like an instrument of revelation. Garrity's ledger was the backbone of the case. It showed payments and names and crude ledgers that connected Harper to a string of illegal seizures and sold-off cattle. The clerk who had authenticated it testified under oath. The butcher, the blacksmith, Mary Ellis, they all told their stories. It was a chorus of ordinary people who realized that the law's glow is only as trustworthy as the hands that hold it. Harper shifted in his seat as the evidence accumulated. He tried to accuse us of conspiracy, suggested that we were a band of women led by a widow with a grudge. It was a cheap shot, the sort of belittling men use to try to make truth an act of hysteria. I had expected it and had steeled myself. I answered not with heat but with clarity. This is not about me. I said softly into the microphone. This is about the ledger and what it shows. This is about the men who sold their neighbors out for coin. At trial's close, the judge, who had been prodded by the community into yielding integrity, rendered a verdict of guilty on several counts of corruption, conspiracy, and dereliction. Harper's sentence was not a spectacle. It was a measured correction applied to a man who had used the law as a weapon. He was confined, stripped of his badge, and ordered to pay restitution where possible, though restitution could never truly heal the dead or call back lost sons. The court's decision did not erase Sam's death, but it did formally recognize what I had known in the marrow of my bones. Sam had been killed under lies and a system of corruption. Jonah walked out of that courthouse with me at his elbow, not as my anchor, but as my equal. A reporter followed us with a quill and a hungry pen. She asked if romance followed triumph. I answered her plainly, we came together for justice. We remained together for companionship. There was in my voice a kind of authority that surprised me with its own sound. The aftermath forced changes in the county that took time. Deputies shifted who they answered to. Men who had profited quietly found less demand for their services. And the women who had once feared speaking found themselves teaching others the ledger skills that had made our case so compelling. The cooperative we had founded grew into something resembling a small power block. We bought a share in the rail buying house and negotiated fair prices for our stock. We placed women on the boards of local farmers' associations. The world had not been made perfect, but it had shifted on its pivot. Jonah stood up straighter after the trial in a subtle way, the way a man does when he finds his feet on solid ground rather than shifting soil. He found work as a foreman for a ranch that respected him and paid him fairly. I took a share in a buying association, a thing that meant more financial security than the shaky months before had allowed. We built a life together not out of passion alone, but out of the shared knowledge of what it costs to stand up. Our romance was still messy and real. We argued over small things, the way to stack hay, whether to let a stray dog stay, but those quarrels were the peaceful currency of intimacy, not the desperate bids of dependency. We shared laughter by the dozen. We tended the garden that Jonah insisted on planting, though he had never owned a spade before he met me. It flourished in a way that made neighbors stop and remark. There were days when I still walked past Sam's chair and felt the tug of memory. I carried Sam with me as a book carried in a satchel, always present but not the only thing I had to tend. To honor him, I named our orchard for him, Sam's Row, and grafted trees that would one day bear fruit for other families. It felt like a tribute and a promise. Through it all, I never lost sight of the women around me. We built a school fund together and pushed for a local ordinance that protected small landowners from predatory writs. The county was never perfect, but it had become more hospitable to the kinds of lives that let people like me and the women I loved live with dignity. Time is strange when you're building something permanent. It stretches and compresses, and before you know it, seasons have passed like pages in a book. 3 years after the trial, the ranch had a new fence line, a leaner herd, and a small building by the lane where we taught ledger skills on Thursdays. I had drawn up deeds in my own name, and had the satisfaction of a bankman who now addressed me with something bordering on respect. Property had ceased to be a thing a marshal could sequestrate with his whim. It was now my own. Jonah and I lived in a house painted the kind of green the valley takes on in late May. He had a workshop where he made saddles and fixed harnesses, and I had a study where Sam's ledgers sat in an oak box that would someday be a lesson far beyond our small valley. We were married, not in a legend, but in a kitchen with a cake baked by women who'd stood with me in the courthouse. The vows were said, yes, but the real promise had been made in the trenches of the fight, to stand together as equals. Women from 3 neighboring farms came to our Thursday meetings, bringing their own notebooks and worries. We taught children the basics of accounts, and the boys and girls who attended learned that numbers could be used to protect them as surely as a rope could hold a load. The cooperative grew into a buying house that paid fair prices and insured against theft. For the first time in my adult life, I felt a measure of security that had nothing to do with men with badges. People often ask if revenge tastes sweet when justice is served. I'd say it's not about sweetness. It's about a steadying. The county never erased Sam's absence, but a life built on autonomy and a chosen partner sates a hunger revenge never could. We harvested apples from Sam's Row, their skins rubbed with sun and soil, and sold the cider at the market. The money went into school books and the small fund that helped women in the valley buy their first horse or a half-acre of land. There was one winter when Harper's kin tried once more to reclaim slivers of influence. It was a test after the main fight had been won, the ripples that persist. We met the threat with the same tools we'd always used: documentation, solidarity, and an unflagging willingness to make noise. The difference now was that we had built a system in which women were not only participants, but leaders. That made the fight shorter, and the result more permanent. Jonah and I still tended the animals and still argued about hay. He had learned, in a quiet way, to trust me with decisions that mattered, and I had learned to let him handle the things he handled best. Together, we were better than the sum of our solitary pasts. Our love was not a rescue story. It was a partnership of equals who shaped each other into something steadier. On the porch that summer, I watched a girl about 10 practice reading aloud from a ledger she had learned to keep. Her hands were small, but the embarrassment and fear that had once seemed inevitable in that town were no longer the only options for girls. They could keep accounts, argue in court, deliver babies, and direct a plow. The sight filled me with a pride deeper than any personal triumph. My face had changed since the winter Harper burned my fence. The fine lines at the corners of my eyes were from laughter and frowning in equal measure. My hair had some silver woven through now, and I wore it in a way that showed I was comfortable in my skin. Clothing, like everything else, became less a mask and more a reflection of who I had become. Practical, purposeful, and not particularly interested in pleasing men who'd never earned that right. We taught other women to read the signs of corruption. We urged them to keep copies of their own ledgers and to keep their receipts in duplicate. We supported young families and paid for apprenticeship for a woman who wanted to be a blacksmith's assistant, a radical notion in some circles, but an obvious one to us. The valley became a place of small reforms and of stubborn hope. And Jonah, who had been a man of the road and of escape, settled into that life with a sort of joy that had nothing to do with leaving. He found contentment in stable labor, in the sound of a child's laugh at the market, and in the mutual respect that had grown between us. He never once tried to make me his ward. He was my partner. When people now speak of me, they rarely start with widow. They begin with Maggie Wren, who taught the county to keep its books straight, or Maggie Wren, who led a group of women to stand up to a Marshal. Sam's name is never distant. It's woven into the orchard and the ledgers. He is honored, not in a manner that keeps me small, but in a way that is honest and sustaining. Final call to action, speaking directly to women. And so this is where her story settles and where yours can begin to weave its own thread. She was told to bow, first by a badge, then by a town that preferred silence. She rose because she refused to be consigned to a neat ending someone else had written. She learned to stitch wounds and to count money. She learned to teach, to bargain, to stand in a courtroom and speak with the clarity of someone who refuses to lie for comfort. She loved and was loved not as a silvered prize to be claimed, but as an equal who chose her partner because he matched her courage, not softened it. If you are a woman who has been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you carry the memory of injustice and are ready to turn it into fuel for a future on your own terms, this is your company. Subscribe to hear more stories of women who turned pain into power, who wrote their own endings rather than waiting for someone else to hand them one. Like this story, if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness defined by her rules. Together, we were better than the sum of our solitary who needs to remember her worth, with the friend who fears taking the first step. Hit the bell so you won't miss the next tale of women who refuse to be victims, who learn to climb, to fight, and to love as equals. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They are reminders. You are stronger than you know, braver than you give yourself credit for, and deserving of a life and a love that recognizes you as the hero you already are.